Hi, I'm Emma Davies. I'm the Senior Partnerships Manager in the Nature-Based Solutions team at Palladium. Palladium is a positive impact firm working with governments, public and private sector to solve global challenges. But we've also been working in the climate and sustainable land use space for over 50 years all around the world, working with forest-based businesses, helping them to scale up and attract private finance, providing income generation opportunities, which allows the rainforest to stay intact and grow, meanwhile creating jobs and livelihoods within and around the forest. A couple of years ago, we set up the Nature-Based Solutions team and looked at how we could translate what we've been learning in the tropics in a UK context. So today I'll be talking a bit about Revere, which is a partnership between Palladium and the national parks, which is aiming to restore nature across the 15 national parks.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm Kirstin Johnson. I'm the UK Director for the African Wildlife Foundation. I know AWF is not that well known in the UK, but it's very well known in Africa and also in the US. It is definitely not WWF, which I often get asked when sometimes I introduce it. It's 60 years old. It has its headquarters in Kenya. It works across Africa, so East Africa, Southern Africa, and some countries in West Africa. And its key differentiator is it's about African-led conservation, and it aims to deliver positive benefits for both people and wildlife. So our work's really organised into three main areas. One is about African conservation leadership, so whether that's politicians, presidents, whether it's business leaders, whether it's communities, youth, it's about conservation leadership at all levels and not just in the conservation sector as well. The second main area is our landscape conservation approach, which is a comprehensive approach to large landscape conservation, so looking at ecosystems across, sometimes across boundaries, national boundaries, but well beyond the protection of protected areas like national parks, for example. And then the third area is protection of endangered species, so looking particularly at, which are the most critically endangered species and what interventions are needed to prevent further population decline. So that's where all the work on the illegal wildlife trade comes in. That's me.
Abby.
Hi, I'm Abby Irving from the Green Line Foundation. I'm going to steal from Ian Redmond, who's on our board actually. Lucky to have him. Said earlier, if you value the forest, protect the gardeners. And I want to add to that, say, if you value the forest, protect the gardeners, but also protect the protectors of the gardeners. We're a grassroots collaborative organisation working on the ground to support rangers who are on the front line of ecosystem protection worldwide. They're the key workers, you might call them, with this brand, you might call them asset managers of natural capital or natural asset. I'm not quite sure what you want to do now. And they're generally poorly paid, not properly equipped, inadequately trained, and of the over 120 that die every year at work, over 80% have no life insurance. So we work to listen to them, what their need is, properly equip them, have a sustainable model of train-the-trainer model of training, and advocate for them. And part of our emergency fund is a fallen ranger fund which supports the families of rangers who are killed in the field who have no compensation.
So before we get into a bit more detail about these things, it's quite an interesting comparison in a way that you're talking. I know it's a wider thing that Palladium does, but you're talking about UK national parks. You're talking about African national parks. Quite a difference. I don't think we have the hordes of migrating wildebeest in the Lake District. And Abby, the Thin Green Line works all around the world, including Europe with rangers, yes. And there's a complete disparity, no doubt, between how rangers are treated in different countries, but presumably in many of them they really are not only vital, but they're not actually looked after properly.
No,
so you mentioned insurance there, no life insurance. I think possibly lots of people in this room would think that most jobs, whatever, would normally have something for when somebody dies in the course of duty. Thin Green Line, from what I can understand, look after not only the family, just with sort of basic things, but maybe education and so forth.
No, exactly.
So that's something. Do you find that in some of your work, or are you not with the communities you're working with in Africa, that they have, that the people who are actually doing the front line aren't being recognised sufficiently, whether it's by
Absolutely.
governments or whatever? I was wondering.
Yeah, no, in terms of advocacy in the policy field, they're not really listened to. We're talking about communities who are mostly indigenous, often community rangers, men and women, the communities and the rangers are often not separate. They are one and the same, and their knowledge isn't really listened to in the board. There's a disconnect between the boardrooms and what's happening on the ground in the front line.
So Emma, in the UK, slightly different scenario, shall we say, but in a way, the guardians, or certainly the people who are working in those national parks, are the people who've got the vested interest in the proper sense of the word, their interest to keep those places working, special or whatever. So is there more we could be doing in the UK?
I think there's a big opportunity in the UK. As you've made that distinction, the UK national parks are living, working landscapes, and the national parks have been working with the communities that live in those landscapes for a long time. Many of them are made up of sort of farming communities, and the UK is going through sort of quite a big shift in terms of land use and the policy around farming and agriculture in the UK, which I think presents a risk. It's probably quite a scary time for a lot of farming communities, but I think there's a huge opportunity to involve communities more in nature restoration, in being stewards of the land, and creating new revenue and livelihood opportunities and jobs and skills for the future. So I think both an opportunity and a risk there. I think from the perspective of Revere, we're looking at the number of people that we are going to need to involve to reach the kind of scale that we want to in terms of the nature restoration vision that we have, and the need to involve the communities in the landscapes and the national parks to do that, because we want to unlock investment in capital, and to do that you need to be working at a large scale. For that, you need to have communities involved, engaged in the design process, and being willing to shift away from maybe traditional agricultural practice towards putting aside some of their more marginal land for tree planting or wild meadows or other different types of, creating different types of natural capital that can generate ecosystem services that can be sold. This is a new and emerging market, and so what we're seeing is lots of sort of shifting and changing in terms of policy and regulation, and opportunities being created, which I think is probably quite confusing for communities and farmers living in these landscapes, but also a huge opportunity.
I guess, Kirstin, I mean, you're the African Wildlife Foundation, but there's a complete disparity between different countries within Africa. So southern, eastern and western, I think, is where you're working. How do you find there's a difference between how communities are involved in those different areas? Absolutely.
I mean, that's one of the big challenges, is that all these landscapes are different and they've all got different actors. So it might help people if I can paint a picture of how AWF works at landscape level. So typically a landscape of biodiversity interest might have a protected area like a national park or reserve, and you might have a dedicated area of land where there aren't any communities living, for example. But then you might have a whole zone around that national park, certainly around significant parts of that boundary, that might be community land, or privately owned land by a landowner, for example, or it might be a palm oil plantation, for example. And you also might have communities that are indigenous communities that used to exist in what is now a national park, but are now living outside the boundary of that national park. So their traditional access to natural resources, to that natural capital, has changed because of various laws that have come in, or the establishment of a national park. And then you might also have worker camps of migrants who have come into the landscape to work on the oil plantations, for example. And this picture that I'm painting is the landscape that I visited last year in Cameroon. So if you're looking at trying to tackle the threats to biodiversity in a landscape like that, you've got You've got the indigenous communities, you've got the local Bantu communities, you've got migrant workers, you've got, you know, palm oil or rubber plantations who've been there for an extremely long period of time. Then you've also got the government whose mandate it is to protect wildlife in those in those national parks and tackle poaching and other threats to the landscape. So it's an incredibly complex picture, and in different countries, different landscapes, different actors. But essentially the model is the same, which is working with all those different stakeholders who have an interest in biodiversity and in those natural resources, in that natural capital, and finding solutions where all participants can engage in decision making, including communities being right at the heart of that. I think that's a very strong lesson that AWF's 60 years on the continent of Africa has taught it, that unless you have communities at the centre of those solutions, quite often those projects and programmes can fail.
And I guess it's not just engagement with those communities, they've actually got to see a benefit.
Absolutely.
Because they might say, well, we love this forest, but actually we're not getting much out of it. Grandfather tells me this is the most wonderful place in the world, but it's not actually feeding my family. So that is going to be a problem. I guess, Abby, a lot of the rangers in a lot of these areas are actually indigenous people who know more about whether it's a forest or whatever, they know more about their environment than anybody coming in.
Yes, and they're often quite involved in developing sustainable livelihoods for those communities. In Peru, where we worked at the Lacuapampa Wildlife Reserve, the rangers are very involved in trying to make sustainable agricultural projects for the communities. They work with them to find grant funding from governments, etc. So, they're and you're talking about people who are paid maybe $30 a month or something. One point I wanted to make in terms of their value, you know, we're undervaluing them hugely for all the different roles they do. You know, they're monitoring wildlife, researching, data collection, mitigating human-wildlife conflict, education, helping with sustainable livelihoods. The World Bank did some research to look at the multiplier effect of jobs in nature capital management and found that they are the highest of any job. In Nepal, they found it was 3 to 1 for a ranger. So if a ranger's paid $1 in Nepal, then it brings back nearly $3 to the local economy. They found the same in Zambia. And then where we work in Kenya with Big Life, actually one ranger can actually support up to 24 members of that community. So you're talking small amounts of money that have a huge impact.
So to give an insight, because I was getting at previously, the incentive for local people to get involved in this, for all that valuable work you're talking about, they've not, perhaps in the West or in developed countries, it's job security and things. That's something that we've got to be trying to get over, that saying this is not only a job that you might enjoy because it's your forest, your savanna or whatever, but also if we could, for example, you mentioned about the fallen rangers. I mean, if you presumably, he said, looking around the room, I don't know where they are, but if we got a group of the big insurance companies worldwide to say, we'll take out life insurance, I don't know how many, I don't know what the risk would be, but
it's
that's actually the sort of thing we could be doing.
Yes, I mean, it's not, could be done as part of a corporate responsibility, but we're actually not talking about big sums here.
No, we wouldn't.
I mean, our Fallen Ranger Fund, last year, there were 150 recorded ranger deaths last year. We know actually the figure will be considerably higher than that. Of those in Africa and Asia, between 80 and 90% have no life insurance. They said 82% of rangers in Africa and Asia have faced a life-threatening situation, and they go out being paid this minimal amount of money, putting their lives on the line. You know, where it's also about respect. Actually, as a groundworks organisation, it's about respecting them as well as the investment that you know.
And of course, it's not just Africa that rangers lose their life. I seem to remember there was a case in Spain.
In Spain, there were 2 rangers, I think, in Spain. Yes. Now, I mean, Europe is also, there are areas of Europe where we haven't got the funding really to support Europe much, although we have actually just supported some drone funding. But there are also large areas of Europe that are hugely underfunded.
So when we talk about the UK landscape in national parks and what you're doing, in a way, we're trying to incentivise those people who've worked on the land possibly to change their habits of generations. We were talking earlier, I know, about sheep farming in pretty marginal. But if your great grandfather had been doing that, and it's the same, it's very difficult to sort of say stop that, because actually it's not great for biodiversity. It's not. So in a way, what's going on at the moment with the elms and all these other things is doing that. But there's of course nothing like that going on in Africa, or I don't know about India. But we've got African specialists here, so we'll stick to that. And of course, the Descriptor Review actually is actually put a monetary value on the importance of keeping these things. I think you've already heard, and I've heard it a lot from Ian, the value of a forest elephant. I forget, is it 80 US a day or something?
Yes, I think that was what you said.
Yes, I've got it right. That's right. It's a bearded man thing going on over here. So it makes sound financial sense, not just a sort of, oh, isn't nature wonderful, we've got to keep it. It's actually important for the world, but also for those communities. Yeah,
absolutely. You mentioned India. We haven't actually done much work in India, but I know there it's particularly challenging because of the high population and very small protected areas, huge pressures on those protected areas. So yeah, there needs to be incentive to a lot of human-wildlife conflict.
Yeah,
tigers.
So
you have
to incentivise. I guess that happens quite a lot in Africa as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think this idea of incentives is a really interesting one, because in conservation we've talked about incentives for a long time, and conservation, I would say AWF is probably a pioneer of early efforts to engage communities in conservation, but the whole area of engaging communities in conservation has also changed. So, the idea of incentivising communities to become conservation champions or to come on board, in favour of conservation, does rely on incentives of one sort or another. So they might not be financial incentives, for example. There might be traditionally community projects like clinics, or maybe scholarships for children in communities and so on. But some of my African colleagues have recently challenged, and in fact based on a congress that AWF co-convened last year, which was the first ever Africa Protected Area Congress. And we made an intentional decision to really bring local communities and indigenous groups to that conference to make sure that their voices clearly, properly articulated and heard. And the big finding from that part of the Congress was that paradigm shifts really needed to really look at the system of incentives for communities, because they were saying that they're always talked about as beneficiaries of people who are on the receiving end of incentives that other people are going to be giving them. And actually what they're saying is their voice and their interests and their priorities needs to be elevated so that they're a decision maker. So there's a very big difference between the sort of nuances of what those incentives, and in fact, one of my colleagues recently was explaining to me that, actually we should see them as co-investors in nature, because they're in these environments, they are part of a system. And especially when we look at financial incentives from enterprises that link to value chains and sometimes big global companies, if they decide to invest in sustainable ways in those livelihoods, they have a right to a return in the same way that other people participating in that value chain have a right to return. So there's some very interesting ideas that are changing, really shifting the way we think about communities in conservation, and it's a real process of empowerment to be at a decision-making position.
You see, my problem is, as I get older, I get more and more impatient. I hear people saying, we need a paradigm shift. And I'm just beginning to wonder when, how, and how soon, because it might be old man problem, but I just see the world that I knew. I've been passionate about wildlife ever since I was a boy. I just see things disappearing. There's a few things a bit more encouraging. So how can we as people here, what should we be doing? How can we get that shift going? Abby.
I think initiatives like Rebalance Earth, looking at sustainable ways of funding protected areas, in particular rangers and those communities. It's got to be, the pandemic brought it to, in sharp relief really, when parks that were dependent on ecotourism, for example, suddenly they lost their income overnight. There were rangers that worked for 2 years with no salary, but they carried on working because they felt passionately about what they were doing. So we need sustainable, a jigsaw of sustainable ideas to make that funding, model work into the future.
It is very interesting what COVID had around the world. I mean, talking about conservation, of course we are here, but I know, for example, in the Caribbean, suddenly most of these economies were based on tourism, which completely dried up. So they've got to look at other forms, and that's where I worry, because that's when you start destroying very fragile ecosystems on islands and so forth.
No, exactly. That's why I think maybe we need feels like we've gone wrong is not seeing the whole world as a system, us included, those communities, those rangers, that wildlife, that habitat, all part of one integrated system. We see us as separate, so actually we need, for example, those peat lands in the DRC to store carbon that we're producing in releasing at a much faster rate than those communities. We need to see it as integrated, and how we do that is not really we're a firefighting organisation really, we're just trying to keep rangers supported in the short term, but we want to retire and hand it over to governments and business.
So the obvious thing I think we could probably all understand is that the people who live there, the indigenous people in areas, and actually I would include in the UK, they may not be called indigenous, I'd probably get into big trouble for calling them indigenous, fell farmers or something, but people who know and they live there and everything else, they know more about their area than any experts coming in, although it's very useful to have experts coming in, and I picked up the last thing, identifying the different species and so forth, of course, but they know how it works. And I can give you an example of something. Again, it was from the Caribbean, where they were destroying various trees in the forest for incense. They cut the tree and they get the incense out, but it kills the tree. What they actually then did was actually got some local people saying, well, this is what we want. Got somebody else in saying, this is how you should cut it. Don't go to every one. And it's sustainable, and they've got a booming economy, if you like, on that, and some other examples. And I'm sure that there's lots of things that could be done. So instead of having to cut down swathes of forest, whether it's for soya or whether it's for palm oil or whatever, there must be ways of doing these things. Have you got any concrete thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. We have to involve the communities and the people that know the landscapes in the UK as much as anywhere else. And we're working with farmers to help us identify which bit of land is marginal, what's not producing food, what's not bringing in revenue for them, which they can take out of production and perhaps convert into another type of land use. We're working really closely with them because they will then agree to help be the stewards of that land in whatever form that's going to be, and maintain it, protect it for year on year. So they're signing up to, if they come on board with this approach, a very long-term agreement to protect and steward that land. And so they're absolutely fundamental to be involved in it. I think the other thing is to tackle the crisis that we're facing, and for the UK to play its role, we really need to reach scale, and we need to involve many people across many landscapes. And so our small organisation is not going to be able to do that without the involvement of all the different communities.
So Kirstin, in Africa, and I say, I mean, I'm taking a continent there, and every country will have a different. When you're doing a project, how much can you involve the local communities and the indigenous people? Almost, I don't mean quite at board level, because I don't know whether your projects have boards as such, but...
Yeah, I mean, again, it's different in different landscapes. So for example, in Zimbabwe, one of the ways we involve communities is working with the Ministry of Wildlife in Zimbabwe's in parks as kind of allies and co-managers of wildlife, threats to wildlife. So we've set up this, they're fisher communities. They're along the northern boundary of Zimbabwe, where it meets Zambia, along the Zambezi. And this is an area where poachers often come in from Zambia into this part of Zimbabwe. So we've engaged communities in being the eyes and ears of the river. So they're on the river, they're fishing, and they now work with Zim parks. So they're essentially spotting poaching there. I mean, what's really struck me about communities in some of the landscapes where we work is, they know what's going on in those landscapes. They permit or refuse outside influences in that landscape. There's another example in Tanzania, for example, where we again have community scouts working with Tanapa and Tawa in Tanzania. There were poachers coming into that community. They were being paid to put up poachers. They would go over the border into Kenya, poach in Savo, come back, and off they'd go with their products. But once the community was engaged and trained, the community scouts as a level of respect and for being engaged in that way, the poaching routes coming in through that way completely stopped very quickly. So the power of communities being on board with conservation is massive. So there's lots of different examples of that all over the continent in Africa.
And I guess a lot of the rangers are local people from the communities.
They are. Most
they would work better, because you get an outsider telling somebody in a village to stop doing it. It's not going to work as well as somebody from their community. Most of them
are Indigenous rangers, as I say, and increasingly community rangers. A lot of them volunteer rangers, actually.
Yeah. So a community scout is effectively a ranger, really.
Yes, they're not necessarily called rangers, actually. They can be protected area workers. There's a number of titles, but yes, it could be a community scout, exactly that.
And you find that with these people, that gives them a bit of a status, that they feel...
I think if you properly support them, I mean, we have this train the trainer model of training, which includes a first aid element, for example. So often rangers might be, particularly in remote communities, the only person in that community with first aid training. So that's incredibly important to that community. It gives a value to that ranger role. So spreading that out, we have a model where we train 3 rangers in Kenya. They then trained 300 Maasai rangers who then went on to give first aid cover for 50,000 community members. That sort of thing puts it in a good light, that kind of that conservation role of a ranger.
Do you find, you're talking about your community, what do you call them? Community scouts? No, community...
they're called, community scouts, or community rangers,
Have they come into conflict with some of the people in their own community saying...
It's a really good question. Yes, because another community, I was on the board of a lodge in Kenya for a long time that's solely owned and run by Maasai, and they had a rhino, a black rhino, in an enclosure in the community conservancy along with 2 white rhino, and one day the black rhino was poached with a bow and arrow. And there was a real conflict within the community, because there are community members that were really on board with conservation, and they could see the value that this rhino was bringing to the community in terms of attracting tourists and visitors. I think that would be another point that I would make about communities, is they're not homogenous.
No.
So there's lots of people in these communities with different sorts of interests. And that's something that is important to navigate when engaging communities.
Yeah, I can imagine if I was a bad man looking for that, you'd be trying to find the weak link, somebody who's got a problem or something, a bit like you'd have over here with somebody trying to, drugs or something. You try and find a weak link and dangle some dollar bills in front of them. So I can imagine it's very challenging. So, but I was getting at the status of of whether these people suddenly feel almost like, I imagine I know probably the community scouts aren't getting a uniform, but when a ranger puts it on, it looks smart. It makes them feel.
No, there is definitely,
So
and some of the
uniforms-
best rangers are ex-poachers, actually, who've turned
Yeah.
rangers.
Yes.
Provided you properly support them, then it's looked up to. You need to support them properly, otherwise, they can't really afford
So
to
fitting them
survive
out
on-
with the right equipment.
Yeah, exactly.
Even
right
simple
equipment,
as
right
boots
training.
and a uniform and
Yeah.
getting onto
Exactly. I mean,
phones and things.
60% of them say they don't have the right equipment to
Yeah.
do their job effectively, and you're not talking about high tech necessarily, although sometimes it is, but often it's just a pair of boots or mosquito net. So a ranger might spend a chunk of the year recovering from malaria. So that's not very cost effective. None of this is very cost effective. So to not support them properly.
So how do you get your funds, Abby, for doing this? 'Cause,
Well,
I mean,
from rooms like this.
oh right, you don't get there's no government
No.
giving out anything.
No, I mean, we work very collaboratively with our
I
organisations on the ground and trying to work with others to try and co-fund sometimes. But yeah, funding is a challenge.
So I can't flash out the bank account details up on the screen.
No. But our
You're
treasurer's
listening.
here, so she'll give
And the same for you, is it?
Yeah, I mean, I want to make a really important point here, which is, yes, I agree completely. Small amounts of funding can make a big difference. But I think if we're looking at transformation, we're looking at a proper change of scale here. And if you look at large landscapes in Africa, I would say traditionally it costs about £1 million per year to run a landscape programme, a comprehensive landscape programme, and that's being conservative. But what we're actually looking at is a massive funding gap for biodiversity in Africa. And it's been mentioned many times this morning already that, philanthropy on its own is never going to meet that gap. We have something like 8,500 protected areas in Africa, and those all have communities living in their vicinity somewhere. Some of them will have absolutely no investment whatsoever, but they are, at least on paper, places where biodiversity could be protected. Like this idea of having a natural infrastructure for Africa, which is where you have this 30% of land that that people are aiming for. That's where these important, critically biodiversity areas are, and that's why I think what's happening in the finance sector is so exciting, because we're suddenly talking about conservation being part of development in a serious way, and it has to be in order to unlock that finance that's needed to protect biodiversity in Africa. So there are lots of different levels of funding and funding opportunities and different kinds of partnerships, but really in order to have that impact, we're talking about serious development finance that's going to have to flow into conservation, and that's why the Rebalance Earth initiative is so exciting, because it's got such a massive potential.
Two things I was just going to ask. First of all, when you say a landscape, what do you mean by that in an African concept? How big is it? Whatever. I can understand the Lake District or the Peak District. I sort of imagine the Serengeti or Masai Mara, but I'm miles away.
Spread. I mean, we're talking about thousands of hectares, kilometres squared. Some of these landscapes are vast, beyond what we can imagine. If you think about the Mara Serengeti ecosystem that you've mentioned, the Serengeti, I believe, is the largest national park in Africa. I stand to be corrected. The Masai Mara in Kenya is much smaller. It's not a national park, it's a reserve, but it's surrounded by all these community conservancies. So we are talking about these huge areas of land with a lot of wildlife still in them, and where conservation actors are present. Biodiversity is still in a good shape in some of these places, and that's showing us that conservation action really does work.
And I guess when we're talking about the dangers of philanthropy, if you like, being the sole thing, is that it might go for the more iconic areas, the well-known ones. Nobody wants to put some money. I mean, preserving forests with rare flora to stop orchid, or there's more than that, or cutting down trees. That doesn't get the publicity that rhinos or elephants do. So that's why we want something on a bigger scale, so it's fairer. I'm sure that's probably what I should say. There is an interesting thing that is actually a movement which might help. It's actually match aiding. I don't know if you've heard of that, where the government they did start it in a small way, that they will match funds. So basically, if a philanthropist or somebody gives the money, the government will use out of their funds for international development or whatever. They will fund a similar amount. So that's something that's is being pushed, if you like. Obviously, times are tough, as always. Always tough. But but that is an interesting concept. But that's what worries me a little bit, is that we tend to, I mean, we talk about Africa because you're here particularly, but there are so many areas around the world. I know I was reading about the Thin Green Line, you've done a lot of work in Peru around the spectacled bears.
Yeah.
Again, a threatened species.
A threatened species, but protecting that one species then protects that whole ecosystem.
Absolutely.
And that's the place where their rangers are very involved with sustainable livelihoods. So yes, it's useful to have an iconic species. It helps a park get a high profile. But you're talking about the whole ecosystem. Lots of other things. Lots of others that don't. Like, I mean, Ian, actually, we've funded a couple of things that Ian's put us in touch with some of the lesser known places where sometimes really tiny amounts of money. We sent $800 to get some school books to the children of rangers who'd not been paid for 2 years, and they were worried about their children not going to school. The community were feeding them, but they were just upset that their children couldn't go to school. So it's a tiny amount of money in the scheme of things, but it made a big difference.
And that's where crime could come in, presumably. If you go to a family and say, well, you haven't been working for 2 years, here's some money. If you go and get me a...
Yes, and who could blame them in a way?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah. Oh.
End. Well, that's that then. Well, thank you very much. I was getting so engrossed in it, and I thought I didn't know how I was going to make this last. Thank you all very much indeed. Fascinating.
Thank you.